And the idea is that we're trying to support students in constructing civically engaged argument writing. Oftentimes, this might be an op-ed or some other text that would be shared with the public. And so how do we get there? How do we help students get to the point where they're writing a piece like that? And there are plenty of resources from the National Writing Project's College, Career, and Community Writers Program. C3WP is the name of that project. And we're drawing on some of those, but we're also trying to bring in historical primary sources as part of this work. Javea and I are going to share today, but we're also hoping to learn from each of you here as we think about how can we put together text sets to support argument writing in our classrooms. Tonight, we are going to try to provide some tools and some strategies for assembling text sets. That's really our focus for the first half of tonight. And then we'll also share some example text sets both tonight and on Thursday, if you're able to join us. And these text sets are going to incorporate historical primary sources, as well as more recent news articles, infographics, and so forth. Tonight and Thursday, our goal, sort of the second half of tonight, is to encourage you to do some planning of your own with a text set. Go ahead and start searching, putting something together, thinking of a topic. And then on Thursday, we'd provide a little bit more time for that, and then also provide a chance for folks to share what they've been able to put together so far, recognizing that this takes a little bit of time, but maybe even you have some time between tonight and Thursday to put together some resources. You know, teachers have all this time just laying around. So that's sort of what we're thinking about. And because we want to talk about how to do it, but we also want to provide space and support for doing some of this work. As I mentioned, the Philadelphia Writing Project has a grant currently. We're about to start our second year of this grant for creating K-12 curriculum materials. And these curriculum materials include text sets, teacher reflections on inquiry questions that they have, as well as primary sources from the Library of Congress. We're also using Dr. Goldie Muhammad's culturally and historically responsive literacy framework as a foundation for how we think about our planning. And in that framework, Dr. Muhammad has studied the work of Black literary societies. Many of those societies were here in Philadelphia. And she said, you know, what is it that these groups were trying to do, and how did they operate, and sort of what guided them? And she realized that they had 5 pursuits, that they weren't just about knowledge, but it was a little more complex than that. They were thinking about their identities and the identities of others, and that's what our curriculum should do as well. Thinking about, sure, there's knowledge or core ideas that we should learn, and of course there are skills that we would develop as a community. In doing this work, though, they're also exercising criticality. They're looking at the world with a critical lens, a critical eye, and saying, so what's not quite right here, and what can we work to improve? And a lot of that was laid out in Dr. Muhammad's Cultivating Genius book that came out, I think, in 2020. And then in follow-up talks, she's really focused on a 5th pursuit of joy that seems to be threaded throughout all of the work that the Black literary societies were doing, as well as, you know, what we should be doing in our classrooms. And so as we do our planning for these curriculum units, we're asking teachers to think about those 5 different pursuits and plan with those in mind. And then we're drawing from resources from C3WP, as I mentioned, from the National Writing Project. Sorry to use acronyms here. And then the other piece, if you hear us say TPS tonight, if you're not familiar, Teaching with Primary Sources. And that's a program through the Library of Congress that both is a grant program, but also a lot of different professional development opportunities and resources for teachers. So we're trying to weave these different pieces together to create what we think are really useful and exciting sets of curriculum materials that support argument. And I'm going to turn it over to Javea to talk through an example of what she's been working on.
So what I've been working on with my middle schoolers in our Instruction Media Center is we're looking at child labor laws. And in middle school, they're thinking about getting part-time work. They want to work after school. They want to make their own money. So I definitely thought that this would be kind of a grabber at the beginning of the year, especially since they just came off the summer. So the first thing I did is I found an essay that was easier to read, and it was The March of the Mill Children. And it was just an overall of what had happened, how children were working, and they were like as young as 5. And that really struck a chord with the middle school. From there, we also looked at another article, which was the Women Champion for Reform in the late 19th and 20th centuries. And I was able to get that from News ELA, which is a free resource for teachers. And there it gave not only some additional information about Mother Jones, but some other activists during that time period. So we had some more where we're thinking about this. And then the last piece that I had gotten was this children's book, which is Mother Jones and Her Army of Mill Children. The best thing about this book is that it is written from the perspective of Mother Jones. And what it does is really shines through her sass and her personality and her ability to really champion for the children. And the kids were able to really pick up on that. I just read a few because they were older. I only read like 3 or 4 pages just to get them hooked. And then that let them look at it at their leisure. So that's where we started, just to have background and to know what we're talking about. One of the reasons it's so important is because this happened in Philadelphia, and they marched from Philadelphia to New York. So it gave us a chance to think about how long that would take. We were able to discuss if they could do it. And the other thing was that a lot of the early child workers worked in mills and also in the mines. And the mines are very heavy here in Pennsylvania. I chose some pictures that in our curriculum at our school, we do quite a bit of notice and wondering. So if I was working with an early elementary or kids that hadn't had the curriculum as long, then I usually would start with this picture because it gives the kids a chance to notice what's happening and wonder and maybe get some questions going. But by the time I hit middle school with the students that I'm working with, they have done this quite a bit, so I don't have to put it at the forefront. I find it more effective for them to get a written article first because they feel like they're older and they're done with notice and wonder. And then, like afterwards, we'll take another close look at this picture and do some talk around it. On the left-hand side is the Breaker Boys. Those are the boys that were the coal miners. And then on the right-hand side is a picture of 3 girls. And what they wanted to find out was who were these actual children. And it was like almost a research and a mystery that the article did. And they found out that it was a real person, obviously, but she had to quit school in 2nd grade. So we wanted to bring it to the now, to what's going on currently. We know that Mother Jones did all of this work to establish labor laws, but what are they today? So I went to the Pennsylvania Child Labor Laws, which is actually on the Pennsylvania Department of Education website. And with that link that's on there, it goes straight to almost like the FAQs. And it's very clear and it gives excellent direction for kids at that age to be able to understand what they need to do and what their allowances are for their age and for when they're participating in school. Then I wanted to also let them know that we have a luxury almost, because in other countries, there are not as many laws and their children are still working dangerous jobs like it's still in the early parts of the century during Mother Jones' time. I found this article that was from UCLA, and it was about international child labor. It has a wonderful map that they were able to visualize, and also then an article that went with, and it named specific countries where this is still going on. It was also written in 2019, which I asked them, did they feel like that was recent? And they told me no. So I guess perspective is a thing. I think, well, actually, it's a little more recent than you think. So that's where we brought it now. So our question is, what age should minors be able to work? And then what jobs should minors be allowed to have? So I want them to answer this question. These are 2 sample pieces of writing, and it's the beginning of their argumentative work. And this is just our rough draft to start. And from there, my goal is for them to have a conversation amongst themselves and then be able to do that with small groups.
Jabea, I was curious if you could mention really quickly some of the concerns students raised about maybe some work they did this summer.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. Right away, when we started the exploration, I had several children that were very concerned that the law was coming for them because they had babysat this summer. And they were like, oh no, but I did babysitting. And then I'm not supposed to, I'm too young. And I said, well, it's a little different. You have to fill out a little paperwork. So you don't have to be as worried. But what they consider to be jobs that are light work and jobs that are dangerous are very different. And that's where the debate's coming in, because some kids are like, oh, it's an easy job to scoop ice cream. Yes, but at the ice cream parlor, there's chemicals. Is it okay for you to be able to use those chemicals? And that's where the back and forth is going. And they're really exploring the topic a little bit more.
Yeah, there are a lot of great things that stand out to me. I love when you talk about this unit that you're doing. And one of the things that stands out to me is that there's not just one side to this debate, right? It's not a pro con necessarily. You really are getting into the nitty gritty of like what kinds of jobs and what aspects of the jobs and things like that. So students are really asked to take complicated and nuanced positions.
Right. I also find it interesting that several of the children have the same reasoning for wanting to have a job that they did in those early part of the years. They're like, well, people should contribute to their household. They're very strong about that. And I've never, to this point, no one has ever been like, what do you mean? They've just, and they've been very mature about it. And there's been a lot of nodding and acceptance of that fact.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm also thinking about how brilliantly you've woven together these different kinds of texts, right? You've pulled together picture books, you've pulled together secondary sources, ones that are leveled texts. You're thinking about, is it a easier piece to read? Even you excerpted from the children's book, right? And you read the whole thing, right? And
Right.
that's something we can think about with text and text sets as well. You're thinking about when does the photograph come in and things like that. How is the photograph sparking further inquiry, right? You're talking about that as well, that this photograph is driving some things that students want to know more about.
Mhm.
That you've also selected texts that have a local connection. I think we're lucky in Philadelphia that we often have so many historical, topics that we can draw from. And also that you've pulled in things like infographics and that you have gone to sources that are reputable and reliable because that's what you do as a educated adult, right? And so really exciting to look across this text set that you've put together and think through all the moving pieces that are sort of unspoken, like work that you just do, right? Because you're a knowledgeable teacher. And that's the kind of thing that we want to talk through tonight. We want to surface some of the strategies that you might use to create a text set and also learn from you around some of the things that you might do when you create a text set. So I'm going to pause the recording in a moment, but I want us to reflect on our own. And you could type this up in the chat box, but you don't have to send it yet if you don't want to. Like, why would we want to use a text set in the first place? I could be wrong, but a lot of times curricula include a text, right? Or maybe a pair of texts. And we're talking about like quite a few different texts here that Javea has assembled around this one topic. So like, why would we want to use a set of texts? And like, do you currently do this kind of work in your class with 3, 4, 5, 6 or more texts? And particularly, why is a use of a text set useful when it comes to supporting argument writing? So I want us to think about that. I'm going to stop recording and I'm going to ask us to share in a moment. Great. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. So what we want to do now is I want to walk through some suggestions on how you might put together argument-based text set. And this is coming from teachers that have worked with the National Writing Project on C3WP. I didn't number these because they're not steps in my mind. They're really like things that you do, but this process is going to be iterative. So like one of the things you're going to need to do, and it might shift in the middle of the work of making the text set, is you got to pick a topic, right? We got to be arguing about something or around something. You also might be trying to focus on particular argument writing skills. And one of the things C3WP does is there are many units that target things like evaluating evidence or ranking evidence or connecting evidence to claims or writing a nuanced claim. Those are all separate sets of skills we might recognize that students need support with as we read their writing. There's a using sources tool from the National Writing Project that helps us look at student writing and figure out where could we go next in supporting them in deepening their skills. So we're definitely going to need to pick a topic like Javea did with child labor and develop particular skills that we want students to have. And in many cases, it might be having students write a claim and support it with evidence. We're also going to need to figure out what our keywords are when we're searching for texts. And one thing that we've uncovered in previous webinars for teaching with primary sources is If we're looking at historical texts, sometimes the terms that get used, so if we're looking at like Japanese internment camps, this came up in one of our webinars, we might not search for the word internment if we're looking at historical newspapers because that wasn't the word that was used at the time. So we want to think through when we're searching for our text, are we searching more modern things? Are we searching historical databases and archives? And what kinds of keywords would we need if we're going to be searching? In Javea's case, I'm just assuming, right? You're searching Mother Jones, child labor, and Philadelphia,
Yeah.
right? Like things like that. I don't know. Were there any? I'm putting you on the spot here. Were there any
No,
other?
go ahead and put me on the spot because Mother Jones, yes. When you put in child, if you put in child minors, you get children of minors. If you put in child labor, you'll get some rules and regulations. So then you kind of got to do a little dance around to find what you need.
Cool. So like doing that, and that again, that's iterative, right? Once you find a source, you realize there are some terms in that source that you can turn around and use when you're searching. There's this like curation of texts, and the curation I think starts with just kind of collecting, just like looking for, are there a range of formats? Is an infographic helpful, right? Because maybe data is really useful. Are there maps? Are there photographs? Are there videos? And then also what's really important from an argument writing perspective is getting a range of viewpoints. So it might not be that there's a pro con. Hopefully there are a range of viewpoints on any topic that you're looking at, and the texts you pull are going to address or come from those different viewpoints. And in doing this, you're going to have more than you're going to wind up using, of course, but you really do want to have, a good set to work from. Also, don't feel obligated to use the whole text, right? If you find a text, it might be that there's a particular viewpoint in a text, like someone's quoted in a longer piece, and you really just want to pull out that viewpoint. And you could put a series of viewpoints all in like the same document or on different cards, right? Especially if you're thinking about sorting or ranking evidence, you might just be pulling an excerpt from a more complex text. And so really, as you're searching, think about not just the text as a whole, but is there a piece of this that I can pull out and have students focus in on it because it's getting us to those viewpoints that we care so much about. We also might want to consider, are there certain photographs or images and things that are best suited for classroom use and maybe some that aren't? One of the resources we're going to share tonight comes from the Library of Congress, and they have developed a tool to help you think through what we might do when we're searching for primary sources. If you think about things like length, it might be that an excerpt is appropriate. If you have a historical document where it's handwritten, is there a transcript? Even with the video, is there a transcript that could be useful? Do we know who made it? Does it matter? Do we know when it was made? So there are a lot of different things that we could think about when we're looking for texts, particularly historical documents. And sometimes it just might be that we have a photograph, but it just doesn't do the work that we need it to do because we don't know enough about it. We don't know who made it. And sometimes we don't even need all that, but often that's useful. And so there are even more blog posts here that explain or go into detail about each of these different dimensions of what you might think about when you're selecting a primary source. So this will be a resource that we share with you tonight. And I think it's super useful in helping us think through particularly what we do and what we should do with historical documents. So finally, or again, not final because it's not totally in order. Again, this is all iterative, but there's this work of sequencing the text, right? What do you introduce first? How can, after we introduce the topic, how can we then support, expand, deepen the work that we're doing and show multiple viewpoints? And I think that's really important. And one thing that Javea mentioned that is really important to think through with her younger students, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Javea, I think you talked about starting with the photograph because that entry point is maybe a little easier for emerging readers. It also, they're not used to noticing and wondering as much. And so you want to support those habits. But with your older students, they've done a lot of that routine. And so it didn't make as much sense to start with that because they're sort of naturally approaching photographs that way. But starting with a piece of text that makes them feel like older learners and moving from there is really important. So you're doing that work of thinking through which text am I going to use when? And I don't think there's one way to do this, but that's certainly something we should think about. Some other things that we want to share tonight, and you certainly can help us add to this list. Where can we go for texts? Of course, there are many places to go, and we just go to Google, but it's also nice to go to places where you know that there are some pretty trustworthy and useful things. So the Library of Congress, if you're looking for historical primary sources, certainly we encourage you to go to the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress has some separate web portals that you probably could explore if you're not familiar with them. Chronicling America, which are millions of historic newspaper pages that are full text searchable. Congress.gov, looking at current legislation, proposed legislation as a text that we could investigate and dig into. And then also the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. That is a place where you can go and find current news articles. Of course, you could go anywhere, but it's just a great place that's connected to the library. Another place for primary sources is DPLA, or the Digital Public Library of America, which searches a number of different archives. And so it's a great second stop, if you will, if you're going for primary sources. And then some more local ones, phillyhistory.org allows you to search for primary sources, even by address. So if you're looking for a particular neighborhood, you can search an address and there will be photographs and things that come up that are connected to that location. And then if you have a Free Library of Philadelphia library card, you can search a database of 10 different historical Black newspapers, which again, if we're thinking of variety of viewpoints, it might be a great place to go. And again, that's a free database for anyone who has a free library card. Then these are some places that I think Jabay and I like to go. Newsy LA, Scholastic. So I just type in scholastic.com and then a topic like in my Google search, and then it'll bring up if there's a Scholastic article. Time for Kids, Nat Geo for Kids. There are other places that you'll feel like are really heavy hitter places for current news articles that you like to go to. I'm happy to add to the list, and feel free to put it in the chat or unmute. So at this point, I have a document that I'm going to share, and the document has 2 example text sets that we've put together as part of our project. You're welcome to look through those and think about how and why we might have selected those texts. Javea, I don't know if you want to speak really briefly about what some of your students have said about this topic when they've engaged with the set.
They really were quite interested in this topic, and it's because it's like a culture within Philadelphia, so they could speak to it, and they had, oh yeah, I know a friend and I've gotten a ride. But then there was also a lot of work around solution and thinking about where people could ride, as opposed to no, they should never do it, which I also found pretty interesting, that they wanted to really make sure that everyone had the opportunity to do it.
We also have a table with the different parts of this process that we're encouraging to go through, where we're hoping that you can select a topic, think about some search terms that you might use, and then begin to search for text. And if you're not at the sequencing part, that's fine, but it might be something that you also take some time to do as well. The last thing I'll point out at this document, and these resources are adapted from a text sets course from the National Writing Project. And if you go to nwp.org/courses, then you can see all of the argument writing courses from the National Writing Project.